About 74,000 years ago, a single volcano very nearly ended the entire human species, knocked the global population down to a group small enough to fit inside a stadium. You'd think the descendants of survivors like that would spend every generation since running from volcanoes. Instead, in Indonesia, they built their most sacred temples directly on top of the ones still active today. Not by accident, but on purpose, because they'd learned something about volcanoes almost nobody else has figured out. They follow a calendar, and once you know how to read it, the most dangerous ground on the planet turns out to be the most livable. Indonesia is 17,000 islands scattered along one of the most violent collision zones on Earth, and by any normal logic it shouldn't exist in the form it does. When the last ice age ended and the glaciers melted, sea levels rose roughly 300 feet, and an entire continent-sized stretch of land, a place scientists now call Sundaland, went under the water for good. What's left above the surface today isn't really islands in the usual sense. It's mountain peaks, the tops of a drowned world, still visible because they happen to be tall enough, connected only by the water that used to be dry ground between them. Then the ground itself started arguing back. More than 100 active volcanoes line this country, more than anywhere else on the planet, and they don't sit quietly in the background the way volcanoes do almost everywhere else. Lake Toba, which looks from the shore like any other calm mountain lake, is actually the collapsed throat of a supervolcano. The same one some researchers believe nearly finished off the human species 74,000 years ago, an eruption so large it's estimated at roughly 1,000 times the size of Mount St. Helens, though the exact size of its effect on early human populations is still debated among scientists. Decades later, in 1815, its cousin Mount Tambora did something almost as strange and far better documented. It erupted violently enough to change the weather on the other side of the planet, dimming the sun, enough that the following year is still remembered in history books as the year without a summer, with crop failures reported as far away as Europe and North America. You'd expect a place with that kind of resume to be a wasteland. Instead, out of the exact same violence, Indonesia kept producing things that shouldn't be biologically or geologically possible at all. On the island of Flores, cut off from the rest of the world by shifting seas for long enough that evolution simply went its own way, 3-meter-long monitor lizards learned to hunt in coordinated groups, using a bite that combines venom with bacteria, virulent enough to bring down prey many times their size. Real dragons, functionally speaking, still alive today. In a cave not far from where those lizards hunt, researchers found a set of human skeletons barely 3 feet tall, with brains roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, a separate, tiny human species, now known as Homo floresiensis, a find strange enough that it forced textbooks to redraw the human family tree. And on a volcano nearby, 3 crater lakes sit side by side, each a different, almost unnatural color, turquoise, green, blood red, and switch shades without warning as the chemistry underground shifts. Local tradition has an explanation ready. The lakes are where the souls of the dead go, and their moods change color with them. Science has its own version, involving dissolved minerals and acidity. Before we get to which one's actually right, take a guess. What do you think is really turning these 3 lakes different colors, and how often do you think they change? Drop it in the comments before you keep going. The scientific answer, for what it's worth, is that shifting gas and mineral chemistry inside the crater genuinely can flip the lake's colors within weeks, sometimes days, which means, in a strange way, both explanations agree on the same basic fact. This mountain runs on its own timetable, and nobody, ancient or modern, fully controls when it changes. None of this is a coincidence of one strange island. a 19th century naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, working through this same region at roughly the same time as Darwin, noticed something nobody had mapped before. Sail a short distance between certain islands here, and the wildlife on either side barely resembles each other at all. Asian-style tigers and elephants on one side of an invisible line running through the archipelago, and marsupials and cockatoos more typical of Australia on the other. The strait separating them is barely wider than many rivers, but old, narrow ocean channels beneath the water kept species from ever crossing, even during ice ages, when nearly every other route between land masses opened up. Indonesia isn't just built on a violent seam between tectonic plates. It's built on a seam between two entirely different biological worlds, and both of them still show up on the same map today. That's really the whole story of how Indonesia works, and nowhere proves it better than the way people here chose to build. Most civilizations put their sacred sites in the safest possible spot, a protected valley, stable rock, somewhere far from anything that could kill everyone at once. Indonesia's early builders did the opposite, and they weren't being careless. Borobudur, on Java, is built from roughly 2 million hand-cut stone blocks. Took an estimated 75 years and 3 generations of labor to finish, and carries more than 2,600 relief panels and over 500 individual Buddha statues, all constructed in the direct shadow of Mount Merapi, one of the most consistently active volcanoes in the country. There's no inscription anywhere naming who ordered it built or why. The monument was abandoned sometime between the 10th and 11th centuries and disappeared under ash and jungle growth for hundreds of years before it was rediscovered. Its builders vanished from the record. The volcano they built next to is still erupting on schedule today. Not far away, the Hindu temples of Prambanan rise from the same volcanic ground, facing Merapi directly. A deliberate choice, not an oversight, aiming their most sacred structures at the exact mountain responsible for dozens of recorded eruptions. In South Sulawesi, the Toraja people took the same logic even further. Instead of burying the dead below ground, they carved tombs straight into limestone cliff faces and post-carved wooden effigies, called tau-tau, on balconies above them to watch over the community from the rock itself. And funerals here aren't small, quiet affairs, but can take years of planning and involve entire villages, treating the boundary between the living world and the volcanic one underneath it as something to be lived alongside, not feared into avoidance. What looks like ancient history from a distance turns out to still be exactly how daily life runs here. In Bali, nearly 500,000 farmers step into flooded rice terraces every morning, working land that cascades down old volcanic slopes in green steppes. None of it happens randomly. The Subak system, a network of water channels and temple ceremonies that stood for roughly 1,000 years, schedules exactly when water gets released to which terrace and when planting begins, coordinated through temple ritual as much as through engineering. So an entire island effectively runs its agriculture off a shared religious calendar instead of a spreadsheet. 3 generations can work the same paddy shoulder to shoulder without a single spoken instruction, because everyone already knows the schedule from memory. At the more extreme end of that same instinct, at Kawah Ijen in East Java, men descend into an active crater every dawn to mine sulfur by hand, in air that would be lethal to most visitors within minutes, walking past electric blue flames created by burning sulfuric gas and an acid lake concentrated enough to dissolve metal. It looks like a punishment. For the people who do it, it's simply the job that starts at the same hour every single day, dictated by when the gas concentration is safest to work in and when the crews can get the loads out before the heat becomes unbearable. Another entry on the same calendar, just a far more dangerous page of it. Not every part of modern Indonesia has kept that same discipline, though. and the exception proves the rule. Jakarta, the sprawling capital, is sinking. By some measurements, as much as 25 centimeters a year in its lowest districts, with parts of the north already sitting several meters below sea level. This isn't a volcano or a tsunami doing the damage. It's millions of people pulling groundwater out of the ground faster than the aquifer underneath the city can refill. A slow-motion crisis with no eruption or wave to blame, just a schedule nobody built into the city's plans in time. 10 million people still go about their day in a capital that's quietly disappearing beneath them. Proof that when the old instinct to read the ground gets ignored instead of practiced, the same country that mastered volcanoes can still lose to something as unglamorous as water pressure. But the calendar has cruel years too, and this is the one nobody could actually prepare for. On the morning of December 26, 2004, the ocean along Sumatra's coast pulled back further than anyone had ever seen it, exposing the seafloor for long minutes before a wall of water returned and erased entire towns. More than 200,000 people died across the region, roughly half of them in Indonesia alone, the deadliest natural disaster of the 21st century, and a stretch of the calendar with no warning built into it at all. If you want to see how the same country responded by building one of the most advanced tsunami early warning networks on Earth in the years afterward, and how reading a volcano's mood actually works in practice today, that part of the story is still coming, so make sure you're subscribed before it does. Because the response to that decade of disaster wasn't retreat, it was the opposite of what anyone predicted. Tourism didn't shrink after 2004. It grew, and kept growing through a string of eruptions and earthquakes that followed at Sinabung, Lombok, and Palu. People didn't come despite the danger. They came because a country that reads its own ground this closely had, over centuries, turned that skill into an entire way of living worth witnessing firsthand. Bali's own mountain, Agung, makes the point better than almost anywhere else. Besakih, the island's most important temple complex, sits directly on Agung's slopes and has hosted ceremonies tied to the mountain for centuries, timed around a religious calendar rather than a scientific one. When Agung went through a sustained period of eruptions between 2017 and 2019, forcing evacuations and closing the nearby airport more than once, the ceremonies at Besakih didn't stop. Priests adjusted timing and location around the alert level the same way farmers elsewhere adjust planting around the rains, treating the volcano's activity as one more variable to schedule around rather than a reason to abandon the site entirely. A few years on, pilgrims and tour groups climb the same slopes again, on a trail that gets closed and reopened depending on exactly how the mountain is behaving that season. Even Krakatoa fits the pattern. Its 1883 eruption was so violent it was heard thousands of kilometers away and triggered tsunamis that killed tens of thousands of people along the surrounding coastlines, one of the loudest, most destructive eruptions ever recorded. Decades later, a new volcanic island rose out of the same collapsed crater. Locals named it Anak Krakatau, Child of Krakatoa. And today, boat tours run visitors out to watch it smoke and occasionally erupt from a safe distance, timed around exactly the kind of activity reports that would have been unthinkable to track in 1883. Nowhere shows that better than the sunrise crowds at Mount Bromo, where thousands climb in darkness every single morning to stand at the rim of an active volcanic crater as the sun comes up over a literal sea of ash. They're not gambling with the mountain. They're arriving at exactly the hour locals have always known is safest, on a trail shaped by generations of people who learned precisely when this specific volcano behaves and when it doesn't. The same goes for the sulfur-streaked rim of Kawah Ijen and the smoking slopes of Merapi. Every one of them, a place where danger got studied closely enough to become a schedule other people could actually follow. Even the way visitors move through the country now runs on a version of the same calendar. Surfers plan trips around the dry season swells that build along the southern coasts between roughly April and October. Divers time their trips to Raja Ampat around the monsoon reversal, when the currents that feed its reefs run in the direction that brings the clearest water and the most marine life, past the same cleaning stations year after year. Climbers wait out the wet season before attempting Rinjani or Bromo, because the same volcanic soil that grows the world's most fertile rice fields turns into an unmanageable, landslide-prone hazard within hours of heavy rain. None of this is guesswork passed down from a tour operator's website. It's the same instinct that built Borobudur facing an active volcano, just repackaged for people visiting instead of living here permanently. Isolation did its own kind of protective work too. In West Papua, Raja Ampat sits far enough from easy travel that it still holds some of the greatest concentrations of marine life anywhere in the ocean, protected less by policy than by the simple difficulty of reaching it. In the forests of Sumatra and Borneo, orangutans have survived in some of the last stretches of old-growth canopy, left standing, kept intact, mostly because the terrain underneath them was too difficult and too remote for large-scale logging to ever fully take hold. Even Tumpak Sewu, a waterfall dropping well over 100 meters through a horseshoe-shaped cliff in East Java, stayed pristine for decades simply because the descent to reach it, slick volcanic paths, bamboo ladders, unpredictable streams, was difficult enough to keep casual visitors away entirely. The same violent, unpredictable geology that could have made this country impossible to live in also made large parts of it nearly impossible to destroy. Every piece of this, the temples built facing live volcanoes, the rice terraces scheduled by temple bell, the sulfur miners starting at the same hour every dawn, the sunrise crowds arriving on a trail timed by generations of local knowledge, is the same idea wearing a different costume. Indonesia's oldest trick was never defiance for its own sake. It was attention. Learn the mountain's actual rhythm closely enough, for long enough, and the single most dangerous ground on the planet turns from a threat into something you can genuinely build a life, a temple, and an entire economy around. That's the real answer to how a nation born from a drowned continent and rebuilt by more active volcanoes than anywhere else on Earth ends up this alive instead of buried. Not because the danger went away. It never has, and it never will. But because somewhere around a supervolcano that once nearly ended the species, people decided the smarter move wasn't running from the calendar. It was finally learning to read it. There's something worth sitting with in a country that turned its own worst-case scenario into a working calendar instead of a reason to leave. Most of us are avoiding some version of that same mountain in our own lives. The recurring problem we've never actually sat down to study closely enough to predict. The thing we'd rather flee from than learn the actual pattern of. Indonesia's answer was temples built facing the danger, rice terraces run by temple bell, sulfur miners on a fixed morning shift, and sunrise crowds who know exactly which hour is safe to climb into a crater. None of it required the danger to disappear. It just required someone, generations ago, to stop running long enough to read the schedule. If you want to see exactly how this same country built one of the most advanced volcano monitoring systems on the planet out of that hard-earned calendar, hit subscribe so you don't miss it.